All right, this is discussion 4. It's discussion 4A. There's only going to be one part for this. I'm going to talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh. You guys have a reading response due on Monday. I'm going to post this early so that you can see it and look at this if you want to. Basically, in the reading responses, I'm not looking for a polished paper. I'm looking for you to just throw me some ideas to show me that you're really engaging with the story, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And so I want you to talk about, you can connect this to your own life. You can connect this to other bits of history you understand. You can connect this to, you can talk about it, compare it to the Bible, which is something I'll talk about in here a little bit. There's lots of ways that you can talk about this. And there is no right way or wrong way. I'm simply want you to show me first that you've read the Epic of Gilgamesh and you really understand what it says. And second, that you are thinking about it. And what does this mean for history? How do we use this as a document? Right? So you can talk about this in all sorts of different ways. And there's no right way or wrong way. And I'm not looking for a polished paper. I'm looking for you to just give me your ideas. Right? And so I'm really just going to be judging this on your ideas. And you can think of it maybe as this. Suppose we're in class and I said to you, tell me something about the Epic of Gilgamesh, and you throw out something. It's kind of a half-formed idea, but you sort of develop it while you're talking to me. That's essentially what I'm looking for in the reading responses. I'm not looking for a polished paper. I'm just looking for you to show me that you've read it and that you're thinking about it. All right? So that said, here I'm going to talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh. I'm going to talk about some themes that I think are important in there. These are the reasons that I assigned this book. Because I really think it is a fascinating historical document. First of all, let me just talk about the story itself. It was probably oral, a recited poem before it was written down as the Epic of Gilgamesh. And we know that because if you've read it, you certainly know there's a lot of repetition. They use the same phrases over and over again, and they repeat them. And there's and it circles back and uses the same phrases again. Those are mnemonic effects, devices that are put in there to help somebody reciting the long poem to remember the poem, right? And so those are signs that it was originally an oral piece of work. It was not written down. It was only written down later. So we know that the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest examples of it we have are about 2600 BCE. They're written on clay tablets in cuneiform writing. It's entirely possible that the Epic of Gilgamesh was around before that. And the tablets that we have thousands of tablets, maybe not thousands, hundreds of tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh, but they're all fragments. And so the whole story has been pieced together by historians, and we're not at all sure that there weren't other parts that we still haven't discovered or that we've pieced it together correctly. And it might even be that there were 5 or 6 different versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh that were complete stories all by themselves, and that we've combined them by accident because we don't know that they're separate stories. So it's kind of constructed, and if you actually look at different versions of it, different published versions of it, you might find whole chunks that are missing from one version and they're there in another version, or they might be in different orders. So essentially, this is pieced together. Now, what's kind of interesting is that we have the Epic of Gilgamesh because it was actually used as a school assignment. When students were learning how to write, the cuneiform was actually, you had this sort of flattened stick, and you would press the end of the stick into wet clay, and you would create a series of little triangular indentations, and you would arrange them in certain ways, and that's cuneiform writing. And it takes a real trick to learn how to do it well, and so students had to spend a lot of time just practicing, and so they would be given a copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and they would just copy it down. And so we actually have archaeological digs all over the Middle East that keep turning up fragments of clay tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh, because once you've used a clay tablet, it dries, and then you can't use it again. And so people would just throw them away, and so we have garbage versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh all over the place. So that's where the story came from and why we have it. It really was first put together as a whole thing in the 1920s when they deciphered cuneiform for the first time. And so it's really we've only had it for about 100 years. Of course, we meaning human beings, had it for thousands of years before in ancient Sumeria. But as modern West, we've only had it for about 100 years. So let me talk about themes. I want to talk about 3 themes. There are other themes in here. You can talk about lots of themes. But I want to talk about these 3 themes. The first is, this book is in many ways a metaphor about the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture. And Enkidu is the key figure here. Enkidu is, he's created by the gods to give a rival to Gilgamesh, to give Gilgamesh something to do. And Enkidu just shows up outside the city of Uruk, and he's a wild man. He's covered in hair, and he talks to the animals, and he's super fast and super strong, etc. And so he is a part of nature, right? He is a wild man. He's not civilized, right? But then the hunter wants to catch him because Enkidu is killing his livestock and eating him or something. And so he wants to catch him. So he brings a prostitute out from Uruk, the harlot, they call her. And she basically lies down naked, and Enkidu comes up and has sex with her for a week, according to the epic. But then once he's had sex with the harlot, the animals won't go near him anymore, and he's cut off from nature. He can't go back. Right? And so instead of going back to nature, he goes to Uruk, and he meets Gilgamesh, and he fights Gilgamesh and all the rest. But this transition is really crucial because it says a couple things. Essentially, Enkidu is going from being a hunting and gatherer who's in touch with nature, who can talk to the animals, who has all sorts of skills involving nature, and then suddenly he can't, and he's got to go live in an agricultural society. And once he's gone to an agricultural society, he can't go back to nature. Right? So in a certain way, this book is telling us that how people at the time thought about the transition to agriculture. They thought of it as once you've gone to agriculture, you can't go back to nature, partly because you forget all the knowledge you used to have after a couple generations. You just don't know which plants are edible, etc. So you're kind of stuck, and partly because population pressures don't allow you to go back to hunting and gathering. And here's where the second thing comes in, which is that the harlot represents sex here, right? That the Enkidu has sex, and once he has sex, he can't go back to nature. And this is an interesting way of saying, I think it's an allegorical allusion to population growth, that once people settle down with sedentary agriculture, birth rates go up. And in particular, we know that in most hunting and gathering societies, there's a lean period of a couple months where there's really not much food. And so people are basically fasting, or they're eating very little for a couple months. And this actually suppresses the fertility of human beings, that they have a much lower birth rate when they have periodic fasting like that. And so the birth rate, and in hunting and gathering societies, women often breastfed children for much longer. And we know this from hunting and gathering societies that are still around. They breastfed children longer. And so the average woman in a hunting and gathering society probably had a child about every 2.5 years, or got pregnant every 2.5 years. In an agricultural society, you have year-round food, and this tends to cause fertility to rise. And so in agricultural societies, women of childbearing years had a child, got pregnant about once a year on average. And that's a lot more children. And so in a sense, what the book is saying, what the story is saying, is that agriculture goes along with increased fertility. And so having sex sort of is, once you have that increased fertility through sex, now you can't go back to being a hunter and gatherer because there's too many people. Right? You can't do it anymore. You've got too high a population. And so to a certain extent, sex becomes the thing that locks you out of a hunting and gathering society once you've made that transition to agriculture, because sex becomes much more fertile. And so the story of Enkidu is sort of a metaphorical way of showing us that once you go to agriculture and start becoming fertile, you are suddenly locked out of the hunting and gathering lifestyle. You're sort of locked out of nature, and the act of sex, the fertility of sex, keeps you locked out of nature. You can't go back, right? Now, this is actually very interesting because it's a similar theme to a story that's much more familiar to all of us, which is the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden from the Bible. Book of Genesis. And essentially the story is this, that God creates Adam and Eve, and he puts them in charge of the Garden of Eden, and everything is hunky-dory. They have all the food they could eat, and everything is wonderful. And God says you can eat anything you want to, just don't eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That tree over there. But Adam and Eve, the snake convinces Eve to do it, and Adam and Eve eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And as a result, they suddenly see that they're naked and they become ashamed. and they hide because they're naked. And God comes looking for them. He's like, why are you hiding? And they said, because we're naked. He said, well, how do you know you're naked? And they said, well, we ate the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so God casts them out of Eden. He sends them away. And as he's sending them away, he curses them. And the curse is this. He says, Adam, you will have to rest your living from the ground by the sweat of your brow. And Eve, you will suffer in childbirth. And so essentially, you can read this as also a metaphor on the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture. When Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden, they can eat, they have all the food they want, they don't have to work for it, and they're wandering around sort of innocent, and they don't know anything. But then they get cast out of the Garden of Eden, and now Adam has to do agriculture. He has to wrest his food from the ground by the sweat of his brow. He's got to work to get his food from agriculture. And Eve now has the pain of childbirth. And so essentially, once again, the transition to agriculture has to do with sex, and you can't go back, right? They can't go back to the Garden of Eden. And so once again, it's an irrevocable transition. And in fact, the next story in the Bible reinforces this, the story of Cain and Abel. Adam and Eve have two sons, Cain and Abel, and one of them's a hunter and one of them's a farmer. And and Adam likes the hunter's meat better than the farmer's produce. So the farmer, Cain, gets mad and he kills his brother Abel. And, not too subtly, the farmer killed the hunter and gatherer, right? And so Abel then gets sent off to live in another land, and Cain does. And Cain is marked. God marks him with the mark of Cain, which tells people he's a murderer. Well, this is another metaphorical thing, that people in agricultural societies, we know, were less well-nourished. They ate a much more restricted diet, and so they often had shortages of vitamins and minerals, etc., and not enough protein. And so they were malnourished. You could walk through the world in 3000 BCE, and you could see somebody and say, oh, you're a farmer. I can tell because you're small and malnourished, and you're a hunter-gatherer. You're bigger and healthier, right? And so in a sense, that's the mark of Cain, right? The Cain has been marked as a farmer, and his very physical appearance shows people that he has killed off the hunter and gatherer, and he is a farmer, right? So this is one of the themes, that the transition to agriculture is sort of there in that story. And Enkidu is actually a metaphor for human beings leaving nature and going to become agricultural, and how sex is intimately related to that, because fertility prevents you from going back, right? Once you start agriculture, you have the increased fertility. That means more and more people, and you have to feed them, so you have to do more agriculture. You can't go back to hunting and gathering. Second big theme is gender roles. If you look at the characters, I mean, the main characters here are Enkidu and Gilgamesh, and both of them are presented as real men. What does that mean? They're strong, they're athletic, they can fight, right? Those are the main skills, right? They're not artists, they're not writers, they're not philosophers, they're not priests, they fight. Right? And Gilgamesh in particular is presented as sort of the epitome of masculinity because of that. So physical prowess and warfare tend to be built into the idea of masculinity. Even as far back as the Epic of Gilgamesh, warfare is associated with masculinity, right? A second issue here is that the men in this story, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, are really... They really are only interested in their own personal glory, right? They're looking for ways to find glory in whatever. They're not really worried about doing good things for other people. And in fact, they murder Humbaba just for the hell of it, basically. So they're really sort of self-focused, and they're focused on accomplishment and glory and achievement, right? You look at the female characters, there's really three. There's Gilgamesh's mother at the beginning, there's Ishtar the goddess in the middle, and there's the harlot who shows up briefly. Well, all three of them are actually associated with reproduction or sex, right? Gilgamesh's mother is his mother. She gave birth to him. That's her main claim to being in the story, is that she produced Gilgamesh as a child. Ishtar shows up and wants to have sex with Gilgamesh, and when he refuses, she goes berserk and goes and gets the bowl of heaven and tries to destroy Uruk, right? And the harlot is basically there simply as a sexual object for Enkidu, and it's a way for the hunter to trap Enkidu. And so in a sense, this story clearly associates women with sex and reproduction, and it associates men with other sorts of accomplishments, especially warfare. This is one of the key ideas behind patriarchy, and I haven't talked too much about patriarchy, but patriarchy is basically the social structure that emerges in various societies, but usually agricultural societies. It's a social structure in which men are put in positions of power and are given control over economic wealth, etc., and women are largely restricted to reproduction. And a lot of people have pointed out that if you look at hunting and gathering societies, they don't have patriarchy. They don't have this sort of strict gender roles and men are put in charge and women are not. It's a relic of agriculture, right? And there are all sorts of theories I'm not going to go into about what that connection is. But essentially, once you get an agricultural society, you tend to see patriarchy emerge, right? And the Epic of Gilgamesh is a clear example of that, right? And again, you can see there's a connection also. I just talked about how the connection of agricultural societies and fertility, well, imagine the impact on women's lives if they're getting pregnant far more often, right? And there is no birth control, and childbirth is often deadly. So this puts women at a disadvantage. Perhaps agricultural societies are just recognizing that, or perhaps men are taking advantage of that to sort of seize advantages for themselves. There's all sorts of ways you could think about that and argue about that, but that's one thing you might want to talk about in your paper. The third theme I want to talk about is government and religion. This book tells us a fair amount about early governments and early religions. On the government side, Gilgamesh is king. Why is he king? Well, he's a great warrior. Is that all you need? And then you look at what Gilgamesh does. Basically, he does nothing for the people of Uruk. He rapes the women, he beats up the men, he's bored a lot, and yet the people have no idea that they can get rid of him. They go to the gods and say, can you distract him so he doesn't do this to us anymore? So basically, this tells you that early governments really didn't provide much in the way of services, although, as I mentioned, hydraulic societies, they did organize irrigation, et cetera, like that. But often early governments might, you could sort of see them as parasitic. They're just living off of the work of the farmers, right? And not providing anything back at all. Although, as I said, they are providing this organization for hydraulic societies. But then another part of this is that what is Gilgamesh by the end of it is really supposed to be a good king. Well, what happens in the meantime? And essentially, I think you could say that he gets humbled, right? He loses his friend Enkidu. He tries to find immortality and he fails. And so he sort of gets humbled and he realizes that glory is not the be-all and end-all. And he presumably returns to be a better king, right? So this offers us some insight into what's going on with government and how people thought about government and what they expected government to provide to them. A second issue is religion. And, I've already talked a fair amount about religion in the course that this is a transactional religion. The gods were seen as not really caring about human beings. They made deals with human beings. But it's kind of interesting to watch the gods that show up. Ishtar shows up and she demands sex, and when he gets denied, she goes kind of ballistic and gets really angry. And then in the Paranapishtim story, which is, the forerunner to the story of Noah, the gods decide to wipe out all of humanity because they're annoying, and they send a huge flood, but then the flood gets out of control and the gods run away and hide because they're afraid of their own storm. And then when the storm finally dies down, the gods are really hungry, but they've killed all the people who offer them sacrifices, so they don't know what to do until Paranapishtim or Uttanapishtim starts a burnt offering, and then the gods come, and the book describes them as being like flies, just coming to the burning meat. And so there's really not a lot of sort of respect for the gods here. There's not a lot of idea that the gods are wise or see things that human beings don't. The gods are just sort of human beings with superpowers with all the foibles of human beings. So this is an interesting conception of the religion, and it tells us something about these early societies, that they really didn't think that the gods were in control and managing things well. They sort of felt like things were a little out of control, that life sucked and bad things happened all the time, and there can't possibly be gods in control of this. The gods themselves have to be kind of incompetent, right? So that's an interesting perspective on that. You can certainly, when you're writing your reading responses, do all sorts of things. You can talk about any of these. You can talk about other things. Maybe there's some, you can talk about a scene and talk about what that implies about history, etc. You can talk about what this tells us about cities, perhaps, or you can talk about, you could compare this to Egypt or something else. You can compare it to the Bible if you know more about the Bible. You could talk about what you want to talk about, right? And so I'm just looking for that you show me that A, you've read it, and that B, you're starting to really think about it. What does this mean? What can this tell us about history? You can also, if you want to, just talk about what can this book tell us about history, right? So those are just some ideas for doing your first reading response.